There is a door in the old house that nobody opens in December. It is not locked. It is not broken. It is simply closed, the way a mother closes a door when she has already decided, quietly, that this room will not be lived in again until the snow is gone. On the other side of that door, a bed frame with no mattress, a window with frost climbing the inside of the glass, a silence so complete you can hear the house settling in the cold, the way old wood does when the temperature drops far enough to make the boards complain. This was not a haunted room. This was a bedroom in the middle of winter, in a home that had made a decision. Because heating an entire house cost money that did not exist. Coal was rationed by the bucket, not the ton. Wood was counted, not assumed. And in a house like this, in a winter like this, a family did not warm every room and hope the money would stretch. They chose one room, and they let the rest of the house go cold. Grandma did not think of it as losing space. She thought of it as saving her family. By the second week of November, the transformation had already begun. The good parlor, the one used for company, was the first to go dark. Its door was shut, a folded quilt wedged along the bottom to stop the draft from crawling under it, and into the hallway. Upstairs, the children's rooms went next. Mattresses dragged down the narrow staircase, one at a time, thumping against each step, until they landed in a pile on the floor of the one room that mattered, the room with the stove. That room became everything. It became the kitchen, and the bedroom, and the sewing room, and the place where homework got done by lamplight, all folded into one space no bigger than a modern living room. A family of 5, 6, sometimes 7, learned to live inside the reach of a single fire. This is the part modern life has almost completely forgotten. For a lot of families raised by Depression-era parents, winter did not mean turning up a thermostat. It meant turning the whole house inward, until only one room still had breath in it. If you grew up hearing your mother or your grandmother talk about the winter room, or if you remember a house where certain doors simply stayed shut from November to March, you were hearing an echo of something older than you realized. You were hearing the sound of a family choosing survival over comfort. And somehow, in the middle of that choice, finding something that looked a lot like closeness. Because here is what nobody tells you about a house that shrinks in the cold. The smaller it gets, the more it holds. A house with 6 warm rooms and 6 separate lives can feel emptier than a single room where everyone sleeps within arm's reach of each other, where the youngest child falls asleep to the sound of a mother mending a coat by the stove, where an argument cannot last long because there is nowhere to storm off to. This was not a cozy postcard. It was hard. It was crowded, and it smelled like wood smoke and wet wool, and privacy became a word that belonged to a different kind of life, one this family did not have the money for. Nobody is going to pretend that a bedroom with frost inside the window was pleasant, or that sharing one room with 5 other people, for 4 months, was easy. But it was not helpless. It was calculated. It was, in its own quiet way, a system, built by a woman who understood something that modern homes have almost entirely lost. That warmth is not something you are owed. It is something you protect, one closed door at a time. Tonight, we are going to walk through that house. Room by room, door by door. We are going to watch it close for the winter, watch a family fold itself into a single lit space, and watch it slowly reopen when the frost finally lets go. By the end, you may understand your own grandmother a little better than you did an hour ago. The closing of the house did not happen all at once. It happened the way most important decisions happened in a home like this. Quietly, without announcement, in the small motions of a woman who had already done the math in her head before anyone else noticed the temperature had dropped. It usually started with the windows. Grandma would stand in the good parlor, the room saved for Sunday visitors and holiday company, and she would look at the glass the way a captain looks at the sky before a storm. She was not admiring the frost patterns, she was calculating heat loss. A window like that, in a room like that, was a hole in the family's budget, shaped like a rectangle. Every degree that room tried to hold was a degree stolen from the fire, and the fire did not have degrees to spare. So the curtains came down first, not the light lace ones used for show, but the heavy ones, pulled from a trunk that only came out in November. They were thick, sometimes doubled, sometimes stuffed with old batting or rags sewn between two layers of fabric, and they did not decorate a window so much as seal it. Behind those curtains, the glass could keep freezing. It no longer mattered. The room on the other side of that fabric was about to stop existing, at least for the next 4 months. Then came the door. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a house when a mother closes a door she knows will not open again until spring. It is not dramatic. Nobody cries. Nobody makes a speech about sacrifice. She simply turns the handle, checks that it has caught, and maybe presses her palm flat against the wood for a second longer than necessary, not out of sentiment, but out of habit, the way you check that something is secure before you walk away from it. Behind that door, a life that would wait. A guest bed nobody would sleep in for a season. A dresser holding clothes that would smell faintly of cold and dust by the time March came around. A room, essentially, put into storage. Except the thing being stored was a piece of the family's own space, folded away like a good tablecloth, to be brought back out when it was safe to use again. This is the part that is easy to misunderstand from a distance of 90 years. It looks, on the surface, like deprivation. A family losing rooms, losing space, losing the small luxury of somewhere to be alone. And it was that. Nobody is pretending a 10-year-old girl did not miss having her own bed, her own corner, her own 4 walls to retreat to when she wanted to cry without an audience. But look closer, and it stops looking like loss. It starts looking like triage. Because a house is not actually one thing. It is a collection of small climates, and in winter, a poor family could not afford to maintain all of them at once. Heating a house in the 1930s, for a working family, meant heating with coal that had to be purchased by the sack, or wood that had to be cut, hauled, split, stacked, and rationed like anything else that cost money and effort to produce. There was no dial on a wall that could summon warmth from nowhere. There was only the stove, and the wood pile beside it, and a number in Grandma's head that told her exactly how many days that pile needed to last. If the whole house tried to stay warm, the woodpile would not make it to February. If the whole house tried to stay warm, someone would be out in the cold, splitting logs in weather that made every task twice as hard and twice as dangerous. So the equation was simple, even if it was not easy. Shrink the house, and the house survives the winter. Try to keep the house full-sized, and the house, and the people in it, might not. This is where the Depression did not just change bank accounts. It changed architecture, not the walls themselves, but the way families used them. A 4-bedroom house became, for 4 months a year, a 1-room house with 3 empty compartments attached to it, sealed and waiting, like chambers of a heart that had temporarily stopped pumping blood. By the time the last door clicked shut, the family's entire world had folded into a single room, usually the kitchen, sometimes a front room if the stove sat there instead, but always the room with the fire in it. And that room did not simply become the warm room. It became the only room. Everything the house used to be, spread across 6 or 8 spaces, now had to happen inside 4 walls. Watch what that actually meant, in practice, on an ordinary Tuesday. The room woke up as a bedroom. Mattresses, dragged down from the frozen upstairs weeks earlier, lay against the walls or folded into corners during the day, because there was no space to leave a bed made up and standing in the middle of a room that also had to serve as kitchen, dining room, and sitting room before nightfall. A mattress on the floor by day was a stepping stone. By night, unfolded, it became someone's whole world for 8 hours. By mid-morning, the same room became a kitchen, and not a separate one. No swinging door to shut, no wall to contain the smell of onions or the noise of a pot boiling over. Whatever Grandma cooked, everyone smelled, all day, whether they wanted to or not. The stove that kept them warm was the same stove that fed them, which meant the fire never really had a single job. It was heating and cooking simultaneously, all day, every day, which was efficient in the way that necessity makes things efficient, and which also meant there was no escaping the kitchen, ever, because the kitchen was now the whole house. By afternoon, it became a workroom. This is the part people forget, because it does not photograph as dramatically as a cold window or a closed door. Mending, sewing, darning socks by lamplight, a father working on a boot sole with a last and a hammer, because a cobbler cost money the family did not have loose in a jar somewhere. A mother patching the elbow of a coat for the third time that winter, not because she enjoyed patching, but because a new coat was not a purchase you made twice in one season. You made it last, or you made do without one entirely, and neither option was acceptable if a child had to walk to school in it. By evening, the same square footage became a dining room, and this is where something interesting happened. Something that does not fit neatly into a story about poverty and hardship. The table, set with plain plates and whatever the pantry allowed that week, was not sad. It was full. Not full of food, necessarily, full of people, full of noise, full of the particular chaos of 6 or 7 bodies trying to eat dinner in a space that would have felt cramped for half that number. And by night, it became a bedroom again, the same mattresses unfolded, the same floor claimed by different bodies than had claimed it that morning, everyone arranging themselves in relation to the stove, the way plants arrange themselves toward a window. Whoever felt the cold worst got the spot nearest the fire. Whoever could tolerate the chill took the floor by the far wall. There was an unspoken hierarchy to it, negotiated without much conversation, adjusted slightly every night, depending on who had a cough, who was smallest, who had spent the day outside doing chores in weather that had gotten into their bones. This is the uncomfortable truth that the nostalgia version of this story tends to skip over. It was not peaceful. 6 people sharing one room for 4 months produced friction, someone's elbow in someone's ribs at 3 in the morning, an argument about whose turn it was to bank the fire before bed, the particular exhaustion of never, not once, having a moment entirely alone, not to think, not to cry, not to simply exist without an audience of siblings and parents within 10 feet. A teenage girl in a house like this did not get a door to close when she wanted privacy. She got, at best, a blanket pulled up over her face, and the understanding, sometimes spoken, usually not, that everyone else in the room would pretend not to notice if she was upset. That was the privacy this house could afford, not physical distance, but a kind of practiced, deliberate not looking, extended to whoever needed it that particular night. But here is the part nobody likes to admit, because it complicates the picture in a way that is harder to sit with than simple hardship. That same crowding, that same loss of space and privacy, produced something else. It produced a family that could not drift apart even if it wanted to. There was no bedroom to retreat to and sulk in for 3 days. There was no wall thick enough to make a sibling into a stranger. Whatever tension existed between a mother and a teenage son, whatever silence had grown between a father who had lost his job and a wife who was too proud to say she was frightened, that tension had to exist inside the same 12 feet of floor space as everyone else's dinner, everyone else's mending, everyone else's sleep. It could not be avoided. It had to be lived through, in the room, in front of everyone, which meant it also had to be resolved faster than modern families, with their separate rooms and separate screens and separate lives under one roof, often manage to resolve anything at all. This is where the story stops being simple nostalgia and starts becoming something more uncomfortable to sit with. Maybe the crowding was the cruelty and the cure at the same time. Maybe a family forced into one room for 4 months a year could not afford the luxury of staying angry, staying distant, staying strangers to each other, because there was, quite literally, nowhere else in the house to go and be one. Grandma understood this. whether she would have used these words for it or not. She was not simply managing heat, she was managing a household's entire emotional weather inside a single room. And she did it the way she did most things that winter, quietly, constantly, without complaint, and without ever once suggesting that any of it was a hardship worth mentioning out loud. Because complaining cost something too. It cost morale, in a house that could not afford to lose any more than it already had. So she did not talk about how tired she was of cooking, cleaning, and sleeping in the same 12 feet of floor. She talked about the fire, whether it needed more wood, whether the draft under the door had gotten worse, whether the youngest child's cough sounded different tonight than it had the night before. She kept the conversation practical, because practical was something the family could act on. Tired was not. And underneath all of it, every single day, ran the quiet arithmetic that never stopped. How much wood is left? How many days until the next delivery or the next chance to buy more? How cold is it supposed to get tonight? And is the answer to that question something the family can survive without touching the reserve pile stacked against the back wall? The pile that existed for exactly one purpose, and one purpose only, the nights when the ordinary amount of wood was not going to be enough. That reserve pile was its own kind of insurance policy, built from nothing but discipline and fear of what would happen without it. Every night, before anyone else in the house was allowed to close their eyes, one ritual had to happen, and it belonged entirely to Grandma. The bricks went into the oven first, sometime after supper, while the dishes were still being cleared. 2, sometimes 4, ordinary red bricks, the kind used for building, not baking, slid onto the floor of the stove, where the heat still lingered from cooking. They sat there for an hour, sometimes 2, absorbing warmth the way nothing else in the house could afford to waste. Then, one at a time, they were wrapped. An old towel, a worn piece of flannel, sometimes just a section of newspaper if the towels were already in use elsewhere, and carried, hot through the cloth, to wherever the coldest sleeper lay that night. A brick at the feet of the youngest child. A brick against the small of the back for whoever had come in soaked from evening chores and still hadn't fully stopped shivering. By morning, the brick would be stone cold again, its job finished sometime around 3 or 4 in the dark. But for those first few hours of sleep, it was the difference between a child drifting off peacefully and a child lying awake, rigid with cold, unable to settle. Where there were no bricks, there were bottles, glass ones, filled with water heated on the stove, stoppered tight, wrapped in whatever fabric was on hand, and tucked under blankets in the same way. It was the same idea wearing a different coat, borrow heat from the fire while it is available, and smuggle it into the night in whatever form the house has on hand, because the fire itself would be banked down low by midnight, and low fire meant a room that grew colder with every passing hour until dawn brought the first real warmth back. This was not comfort in the way a modern house understands comfort. Nobody was choosing a temperature on a dial and walking away from the problem forever. Every degree of warmth in that room that night was something a person had made, by hand, with their own effort and their own timing, and had to be renewed, by hand, the next night and the night after that, for as long as the cold lasted. Warmth was not ambient, warmth was a chore. And it was Grandma who understood, better than anyone else in that house, that warmth run out silently. A fire does not announce that it is dying. It simply gets smaller and smaller, until the room notices the difference, only once the damage of a cold night has already been done. Which is why she was, without exception, the last one awake. While the rest of the family settled into their spots on the floor, arranging blankets, negotiating elbow room, murmuring the small complaints and small jokes that came with 6 or 7 people trying to fall asleep in the same 12 feet of space, Grandma sat near the stove a while longer. She was not resting. She was watching the fire the way a nurse watches a patient, checking its color, its size, judging by instinct built over years exactly how much wood to add so that it would burn low and steady through the night, without dying out before 4 in the morning, and without burning hot enough to waste wood that needed to last until the next delivery. Too little wood, and the family woke to a room gone properly cold, the kind of cold that got into a child's chest and turned into the cough that worried her most. Too much wood, thrown on carelessly to make the room warmer right now, and she was spending tomorrow's warmth on tonight's comfort, a trade she could not afford to make, no matter how tempting it was on the coldest nights to simply pile the stove full and let everyone sleep warm for once. So she rationed the fire the way she rationed everything else in that house, with a kind of discipline that looked, from the outside, almost severe, and that was, from the inside, the only thing standing between her family and a winter they might not get through the way they needed to. Only once the fire had been banked to her satisfaction, low, steady, a bed of coals rather than a blaze, did she lower herself down onto whatever spot remained, usually the one closest to the door, the one that caught the worst of the draft whenever anyone had to get up in the night. She took that spot without announcement and without complaint, the same way she did most things that mattered. It was simply understood. The coldest place in the room belonged to the person who understood the cold best. This is the part of the story that deserves to be said plainly, because it gets lost too easily in the softer, safer version of nostalgia. Grandma was not a passive figure enduring a hard winter. She was the architect of the entire system. Every closed door, every hung curtain, every sheet of newspaper pressed against a drafty wall, every brick warmed and wrapped and carried to a cold child's feet, every log added or withheld from the fire, all of it ran through her judgment, her memory, her constant, quiet calculation of what the family had, what it needed, and how long it had to last. The newspapers deserve their own moment here, because they are easy to overlook, and they were not decoration. In a house built cheaply, with walls that were often little more than a single layer of wood planking and thin plaster, cold did not simply come through the windows. It came through the walls themselves, seeping in around nail heads and along seams where the wood had shrunk and warped over years of weather. Grandma's answer to this was not expensive. It was old newspaper, sometimes weeks old, sometimes saved specifically for this purpose once the temperature dropped, pasted, or tacked directly against the coldest interior walls of the one room the family was living in. It did not look elegant. Newsprint sagged, yellowed, and occasionally still bore yesterday's headlines about unemployment, or weather, or some local church supper, silently observing the family from the wall while they slept 12 feet away in the same room. But layered against a thin wall, that paper trapped a thin cushion of still air between itself and the wood, and still air, even a half-inch of it, is exactly what keeps heat from simply walking through a wall and out into the winter night. It was insulation, built from nothing but yesterday's news and a jar of paste. And it worked, because Grandma understood a principle that had nothing to do with reading a manual and everything to do with decades of paying close, careful attention to where the cold in her house actually came from. This is where the modern comparison becomes almost impossible to avoid, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, rather than rushing past it. A modern home, faced with a drafty wall, calls someone, it schedules an appointment, it orders a product, waits for delivery, and pays whatever the invoice says, often without a clear sense of whether the fix was necessary or simply upsold. There is nothing wrong with that, exactly. Modern life has its own logic, its own economy, its own reasonable dependence on specialists, for problems that require real expertise. But it does mean that an entire category of household knowledge, the kind Grandma carried without ever writing it down, has quietly gone extinct in most homes. Few people today could look at a drafty wall and solve it, that night, with material already sitting in the recycling bin. Convenience did not make the home stronger. It made the home dependent. And dependency is a strange thing to inherit, because it does not feel like a loss when it happens. It feels like an upgrade. Nobody stood in a hardware store in 1965 and mourned the death of the newspaper-insulated wall. They were relieved to buy something better. But 3 generations later, what got lost in that relief was not the newspaper. It was the instinct, the willingness to look at a cold wall and believe, correctly, that you already had what you needed to fix it. Grandma never had that luxury of not knowing. She could not afford to not know how her own house worked, room by room, draft by draft, because there was no service call coming to save her and no credit card to smooth over a mistake in judgment. Her knowledge was not a hobby. It was infrastructure. And this is where the story of the one warm room stops being only about heat and starts being about something larger, the particular kind of intelligence that gets built inside a person who cannot afford to get things wrong. Every choice she made that winter, which room to close first, how thick to layer the curtains, how much wood the reserve pile really needed to hold, which child slept nearest the stove on the coldest nights, was the product of experience compounded over years, sometimes over a lifetime, passed down from her own mother, who had likely faced winters just as hard, in houses just as thin-walled, with even less to work with than Grandma had. This was not intuition. This was inherited engineering, refined generation over generation, tested against real cold and real hunger and real consequences, until it became the kind of knowledge that looked, to an outside observer, almost like magic. It was not magic. It was memory, applied under pressure, again and again, until it became instinct. And here is the uncomfortable question this raises, the one worth sitting with, rather than rushing past. What happened to that instinct in the generations that came after her? Because it did not vanish all at once. It eroded slowly, one convenience at a time, the way a riverbank erodes, imperceptibly, year by year, until one day the shape of the whole landscape has changed, and nobody can quite say when. Central heating arrived, and with it, the need to calculate a woodpile's lifespan against a winter's length simply disappeared, quietly, without anyone marking the moment it stopped mattering. Insulation became a manufactured product, installed once by professionals, rather than a skill renewed every November with whatever paper happened to be on hand. And somewhere in that long, gradual transition, from doing to buying, from knowing to hiring, an entire category of practical intelligence slipped out of most American homes without anyone quite noticing it leave. This is not an argument that modern heating is a mistake, or that anyone should long for frost climbing up the inside of a bedroom window. Nobody sensible wants that cold back. What is worth mourning is not the hardship itself, it is the erosion of the instinct that hardship used to build. A house used to be a system that its occupants understood from the inside out. Increasingly, it is a machine its occupants merely operate, dependent on others to explain how it actually works. Grandma's one warm room was never simply about surviving a season on limited coal. It was about a woman who had made herself the keeper of an entire household's warmth, comfort, and safety, using nothing more than judgment, memory, and whatever material the house already contained. She did not do this because she found it noble. She did it because the alternative, a family that ran out of wood in February, a child who caught a chill that turned into something worse, a winter that outlasted the family's preparation for it, was not a risk she was willing to take. And so, night after night, she sat a little longer by the stove than everyone else. She banked the fire a little more carefully than seemed strictly necessary. She took the coldest spot in the room without being asked, because somewhere along the way she had decided, quietly and permanently, that this particular kind of vigilance was simply part of what it meant to keep a family. Spring did not arrive all at once either. It arrived the way winter had left, one door at a time, one decision at a time, made by the same woman who had closed everything down months earlier. The first sign was never the calendar, it was the woodpile. When Grandma looked at what remained stacked against the back wall, and realized, for the first time since November, that there was more there than the coming weeks could possibly use, something in her shoulders would ease, just slightly, in a way the children rarely noticed, but that she felt like a held breath finally released. Then came the curtains. The heavy ones, the doubled fabric that had sealed the good parlor's windows since before Thanksgiving, came down and were folded back into the trunk they had come from. And light, real, direct, unfiltered light, poured into a room that had sat in shadow for months. Dust hung visible in that light, disturbed for the first time in a long while, and the room smelled the way closed rooms always smell when they are finally opened. A little stale, a little cold still, but alive again. The doors came next, not violently thrown open, but unlocked one by one, over days rather than hours, as the temperature allowed. The bedroom upstairs, the good parlor, rooms that had been frozen storage for 4 months, slowly, quietly, became rooms again. First just aired out, then swept, then finally slept in once more, mattresses dragged back up the same narrow staircase they had come down in November, thumping against the same steps in reverse. And somewhere in that slow unfolding of the house, something else happened too, something nobody in the family would have named out loud. They missed it. Not the cold, not the cramped floor space, or the elbow in the ribs at 3 a.m, but the closeness, the particular, forced intimacy of an entire family who could not get away from each other even when they wanted to, and who had, somewhere in the middle of all that crowding, remembered how to actually be a family, rather than 6 people sharing an address. That is the part of this story that deserves to outlast the hardship it came from, because the one warm room was never really about coal, or wood, or the price of heating an entire house that a family could not afford to heat. It was about a woman who understood that a home is not 4 walls and a roof. It is a system, built and rebuilt every season, run by someone who refuses to let her family go without, even when the money says they should. Grandma did not have a name for what she was doing. She would not have called it engineering, or triage, or household economics. She would have called it, simply, getting through the winter. But what she built, night after night, brick by brick, closed door by closed door, was a form of intelligence that modern homes, warm in every room, dependent on services and specialists for problems a newspaper once solved for free, have largely lost the instinct for. They had less, but they knew more. And what they knew was this: a family does not need every room to survive a hard season. It needs one room, one fire, and someone willing to stay awake a little longer than everyone else to make sure both make it until morning. If this brought back a memory, a grandmother who closed off rooms in the cold, a house that seemed to shrink every winter and grow again every spring, bricks warmed by a stove and carried to a child's cold feet, we would love to hear it. Subscribe to hear the Depression-era home. Like this video, and tell us in the comments what your mother, father, or grandmother did to keep the house working when the world outside made it harder than it should have been. Your memory might be the reason someone else finally understands theirs.